Last night, I dreamed my son hugged me again, not out of duty, but because he wanted to. I woke before dawn, heart aching with a warmth that faded the moment I opened my eyes. The kitchen was quiet, still wrapped in the soft blue of early morning. George was already up, humming low as he filled the coffee pot. I could smell the faint bitterness of the brew, mixed with the sweetness of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter. It was going to be a long day, Carl and Meryl's 15th anniversary. I told myself it mattered, that maybe this time, if I tried hard enough, Meryl would see how much we still cared. I'd spent all week planning the dishes: roast chicken with herbs from our garden, cornbread the way Carl liked when he was a boy, apple pie with the lattice top I used to make every Thanksgiving. Every bite was a memory and a hope. George kissed my temple and said softly, "You sure you want to do all this again, Evie?" I smiled like it didn't sting. "It's for Carl. It's family." He didn't answer, just started peeling potatoes, his silence saying everything. We worked side by side for hours, moving around our little kitchen like dancers who knew every step. The counters were old, the stove temperamental, but it was ours. I'd raised Carl in this house, teaching him to stir batter, to smell when the sauce was ready. He used to laugh and sneak bites when I wasn't looking. Those memories always made me smile, until I remembered how distant he'd become after marrying Meryl. Meryl. Even her name felt sharp on my tongue. She wasn't cruel, not exactly, just polite in a way that built walls instead of bridges. Every thank you sounded like she was closing a door. Every smile was thin, practiced, the kind that said, "I'll tolerate you, but don't stay long." I used to wonder what I'd done wrong. Maybe I was too talkative. Maybe my clothes were too simple for her world of silk and sleek furniture. Or maybe she just couldn't stand the way George and I still loved each other after all these years. Something that money couldn't buy or fake. Around noon, I started packing the dishes. George labeled each container in his neat handwriting: appetizer, main, dessert. I wrapped the pie in foil and whispered, "Don't let them make me regret you." The drive to their house was quiet. I watched the trees blur past and thought of all the little moments I'd missed. Birthdays, dinners, holidays where we were too busy or just keeping it small this year. I told myself this time would be different. When we pulled up to their house, I felt like I was arriving at a museum. The lawn was perfect, the hedges shaped into clean lines, and not a single toy or leaf out of place. It was beautiful, but lifeless. Meryl opened the door before we could knock. Her smile was bright, but her eyes didn't match. "Oh, you made it. We weren't sure if you'd have time." I forced a laugh. "Of course we did. I've been cooking since yesterday." Her gaze flicked to the foil trays in George's arms. "You didn't have to go to all that trouble. We already have catering coming." The words hit like cold rain. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept smiling. "Well, I thought it might be nice to have some of the old favorites. You know, the things Carl grew up with." She tilted her head slightly, her perfectly smooth hair catching the light. "That's thoughtful. Just make sure it doesn't clash with the main setup. Everything's color coordinated." I wanted to ask how mashed potatoes could clash with shrimp skewers, but George gave me a look, the kind that said, "Let it go." Inside, the house was full of laughter, champagne glasses, and music too loud for conversation. Carl was talking with friends near the bar. When he saw us, his face flickered with something like surprise or discomfort. "Hey, Mom, Dad, you made it!" His hug was brief, distracted. I smelled his cologne, expensive and unfamiliar. "You look great," I said softly. He nodded, glancing over my shoulder. "Yeah, thanks. Meryl's been planning this for weeks." "I can tell," I said, trying to ignore the way Meryl watched us from across the room, arms crossed like she was guarding her territory. I busied myself arranging dishes in the kitchen. Meryl hovered, pretending to help, but mostly adjusting things I'd already done. "Oh, I think we'll keep that on the side, she murmured, moving my casserole dish out of sight. It's just a bit heavy for the menu theme. Her tone was polite, but every word carried the same message. You don't belong here. Each time she spoke, I felt smaller, like I was fading into the wallpaper. At one point, she turned to George and said, "You two really didn't have to do this. Honestly, just showing up was enough." George gave her a tight smile. "Well, cooking's what Evie loves. It's how she shows love." Meryl's laugh was soft, practiced. How sweet. How sweet. Two harmless words, but said the way she said them, they meant how quaint, how old-fashioned, how unnecessary. I kept stirring the gravy so she wouldn't see my eyes welling up. When the guests began filtering into the backyard, I took a deep breath and looked at the trays. Golden chicken, buttery rolls, the pie glistening with sugar. For a moment, I felt proud again. Maybe they'd taste it and remember. Maybe this was worth it. George carried the dishes out while I followed with the pie. Meryl clapped her hands lightly. "Oh, how lovely. Let's just keep it on the sideboard, shall we? The caterers are almost ready." The sideboard, hidden behind the floral arrangement. Still, I smiled and nodded, pretending it didn't matter. Because that's what you do when you've spent a lifetime trying not to make anyone uncomfortable. But inside, something was shifting. A small, quiet crack in the surface. The laughter outside grew louder. I heard Carl's voice booming over the crowd, full of confidence and charm. Meryl laughed her perfect laugh beside him, and I stood by the kitchen door watching from a distance, hands clasped, like a guest in a house I'd once helped build. George touched my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded, even though my throat felt like sandpaper. "I'm fine," I whispered. But I wasn't. Because in that moment, I realized something that made my heart ache and harden all at once. You can give your whole heart to people, cook for them, raise them, love them, and still be treated like a stranger. And still, I told myself, maybe there's a way back. I didn't know then that the night would break that hope completely. But I did know this. I was done begging to belong. When I stepped through their front door, I could tell right away that we didn't belong. Everything in Carl and Meryl's house looked like it came straight out of a magazine. The smell of expensive candles mixed with the faint scent of bleach, and not a single thing was out of place. Even the family photos on the wall looked staged, like someone had chosen the exact moment when everyone's smiles matched the color of the curtains. Meryl's heels clicked across the hardwood floor as she came to greet us. "Oh, you brought all of it," she said, her voice light but sharp around the edges. That must have taken a lot of effort. I wanted to say yes, it had, 24 hours of standing, stirring, kneading, and hoping. But I only smiled and said, "It kept me busy." She looked at George's hands, full of foil trays. "You can set those down right there. The caterers will be here soon, so we'll find space for yours later." There it was again. That polite distance. Not rude enough to confront, but cold enough to sting. As George carried the food to the kitchen, I followed behind him, my arms aching from the drive and my chest heavy from her tone. Meryl trailed us, giving little instructions that sounded like suggestions but weren't. Maybe the pie could go in the pantry for now. "Oh, and let's not mix your salad with the one we ordered. The presentation has a certain look." I nodded and kept my head down. Every word she spoke pressed against me like a reminder that I was a guest, not family. Carl came in a few minutes later, laughing into his phone. He gave me a quick hug, his arm still half around the device. "Hey, Mom, smells good. Meryl's been stressing all week. You know how she gets." "I just want everything perfect," she said quickly, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. Perfect. The word hung in the air. I wondered when perfect started meaning without us. I watched her arrange glasses on the counter, moving my dishes to the side to make room. She didn't even look at them. "Carl, remember to keep the playlist running. Oh, and let's be sure people know the catering team's doing the food. They worked really hard." She didn't mean it as a jab. Or maybe she did. I couldn't tell anymore. I busied myself setting the chicken on a serving tray, pretending not to notice how she kept checking everything I touched. George whispered near my shoulder, "Don't let her get to you." "I'm not," I said, but my voice didn't sound convincing. Guests began arriving. Neighbors, co-workers, friends from Carl's office. I stood near the kitchen doorway, greeting a few who remembered me. Meryl floated through the room like she was hosting a fundraiser, smiling wide, never once letting her mask slip. At one point, she leaned close to a woman in a silver dress and said, "Carl's mom insisted on cooking. Isn't that sweet?" The woman smiled politely, and they both laughed quietly, as if I couldn't hear. My face burned. I turned away, pretending to fix the napkins, but the laughter stayed with me, soft and cruel. Carl called from the backyard, "Mom, come out here. People are dying to try your food." For a second, my heart lifted. Maybe he meant it. Maybe this was the moment everything would turn around. I carried the tray outside, careful not to spill anything. The sun was bright, the tables covered with white cloth and gold balloons. People clapped as Carl raised his glass. "Here's to 15 years, to my wife, who keeps everything together, and to Mom and Dad for being here." It sounded kind, but something in his voice felt rehearsed. Meryl touched his arm and smiled at the guests. "We're lucky to have family who help out. It takes the pressure off the real work." The real work. I felt that phrase land deep inside me, like a quiet bruise. As the guests drifted toward the food, Meryl moved beside me again. "Don't worry if they don't take much of yours. Everyone's watching their diets tonight." I nodded, even as the scent of roasted herbs filled the air and people reached for plates. The compliments came, but they went straight to Meryl. "You have such good taste. Everything's so elegant." She thanked them graciously, as if she'd made it all herself. I stood by the buffet table, smiling, hands clasped tight so no one could see them shaking. Every laugh, every sideways glance, every small correction from Meryl chipped away at me. By the time the music started, I felt hollow. I'd spent a day cooking for people who didn't want what I brought, trying to belong in a family that no longer had space for me. When George caught my eye from across the yard, his look said what neither of us dared to speak aloud. This wasn't kindness anymore. It was endurance. And even then, I still told myself maybe, just maybe, things could change before the night ended. I didn't know that the moment that would shatter everything was only minutes away. The backyard lights glowed soft and golden, casting warm halos over the tables. Laughter filled the air, the kind that comes easy to people who don't notice what it costs someone else. I stood near the buffet table, my apron still tied, pretending to adjust the silverware just to keep my hands busy. Carl was in the center of the crowd, smiling wide, his arm draped around Meryl. She looked flawless, hair in perfect waves, diamond earrings catching the light. And I couldn't help noticing how effortlessly she belonged there. People were eating now. I saw them reach for my chicken, the one slow roasted with rosemary and lemon, the same recipe Carl had once begged for as a boy. A few guests nodded with polite approval, but no one said much. It was as if the food had simply appeared, not come from my hands or my heart. Meryl, meanwhile, floated from table to table, soaking in compliments about the decor, the setup, the beautiful spread. Every time someone praised the food, she just smiled and said, "Thank you." I didn't correct her. I just kept refilling plates, my smile fixed, my chest tight. Carl called across the yard, "Hey everyone, big thanks to Meryl for pulling this off. You're the best, babe." Everyone clapped. Meryl laughed and raised her glass. She didn't look at me. George stood beside me, his jaw clenched so hard I could hear it in the silence between songs. "Let's just get through it," he muttered. I nodded, even though my throat burned. We always do. For a while, I busied myself collecting empty cups, pretending not to hear the small talk floating through the air. I caught words here and there, so elegant, modern. Meryl's so talented. Each one stung like a splinter under the skin. Then came the moment I'll never forget. One of Carl's friends, a loud man with a shiny watch and too much to drink, said, "Hey Carl, this food's great. Who made it?" Carl laughed, the kind of laugh that used to make me proud when he was little. He looked toward me, and for a split second, I thought he might say my name. He might give me that tiny piece of recognition I didn't even know I was desperate for. Instead, he smirked and said, "If the dogs behave, maybe we'll feed this to them later." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even Meryl covered her mouth, pretending to scold him, but still giggling behind her hand. My world went quiet. Every sound, the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, blurred into a dull hum. I couldn't breathe. I looked at Carl, my son, and tried to find a trace of the boy who once hugged my waist after school, flour on his cheek from helping me bake cookies. But all I saw was a man performing for his friends, proud of his own cruelty. George's hand found mine. His grip was steady, grounding me. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His eyes said it all. "You don't deserve this. Not anymore." I felt my face go hot, but I didn't cry. Not there, not in front of them. Meryl stepped closer, her voice sweet as syrup. "Oh, Carl, don't be mean. Your mom worked so hard on this." It should have been comfort, but it wasn't. It was pity. Soft public pity that made the laughter sting even more. I could have said something. I could have told them how I spent the night before on my feet, stirring gravy until 2 a.m, how I'd hoped this dinner might heal old wounds. But what would that have done? It would have made me the dramatic one, the sensitive one. So instead, I took a deep breath and said quietly, "George, help me pack the food." He nodded without hesitation. People kept talking as if nothing happened. The laughter rolled on. But when I began gathering trays, the sound shifted. A few awkward glances, some whispers. Meryl's smile faltered for the first time. "Oh, you don't have to. We can keep it out for later." "No," I said softly, my voice calm but firm. "It's fine. I'll take it home." She blinked, unsure what to say. I could tell she wasn't used to hearing me refuse anything. Carl watched us, still holding his drink, still trying to keep the party alive. "Mom, come on. It was just a joke." I looked at him for a long moment. He seemed smaller then, not because he'd lost anything, but because I finally saw him clearly. "I know," I said. "I just don't feel like being the punchline tonight." I turned and began packing the trays, covering them with foil, stacking them neatly. My hands shook a little, but not from anger anymore. Something else had taken its place, a kind of cold, steady strength I hadn't felt in years. As I worked, a memory surfaced so sharply it almost hurt. Carl at 10 years old, standing in the same backyard, smaller, warmer, filled with laughter that didn't wound. He'd hugged me then and said, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to make you proud." And he had, once, until he forgot who he was. I could have yelled. I could have told him what he'd done to me, how that single sentence had broken something I'd been trying to protect for years. But I didn't. I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because I was done fighting for a place in a story that no longer had room for me. When we finished loading the food into the car, George opened the door for me. The night air was cool, the laughter from the backyard fading behind us. I looked back once. The glow of the lights, the faint outline of my son's house, the sound of people who didn't know they'd just lost something they could never buy back. George started the engine but didn't drive yet. "You okay?" I stared out the window, the tears finally coming, quiet and steady. "No," I said, "but I will be." We drove home without a word, the silence between us thick with everything we didn't need to say. When we pulled into our driveway, the porch light cast a soft glow over the flowers I'd planted years ago. I sat there for a moment, listening to the crickets, breathing in the familiar scent of home. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the woman who had to earn her place at someone else's table. Something inside me had shifted. Painfully. Permanently. That night, as I stood in my quiet kitchen and began unpacking the trays, I knew one thing for certain. I was done giving everything to people who only took. And though I didn't know it yet, that decision, that silence, would become the start of everything that followed. The next morning, the kitchen was too quiet. The trays from the night before sat on the counter untouched. I could still hear Carl's voice echoing in my head. That joke, the laughter, the look on his face when I walked away. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of pain, the kind that doesn't just sting but settles in your chest like a stone. George poured coffee and set a cup in front of me. "We don't have to talk about it," he said softly. I nodded, but the truth was that silence had already started to change something inside me. For a few days, I stayed busy, cooking, cleaning, pretending the house needed things it didn't. But I couldn't stop thinking about how it felt to walk out of that backyard, food in my hands, pride in pieces. I replayed every smile Meryl had given me that night, every word that hid judgment behind kindness. The way she'd said, "Don't take it personally," when she called later to smooth things over. Her voice was calm, careful, like she was talking to a child who'd made too much of nothing. "I think Carl just got carried away," she said. "You know how parties can get. Everyone was laughing. It wasn't meant to hurt you." But it had, and her saying it wasn't meant only made it worse, because it meant she hadn't even thought of me enough to realize it could. I thanked her anyway, because that's what I always did. When I hung up, I looked at George and said, "I think I'm done." He raised his eyebrows. "Done with what?" "With waiting for them to see me." He didn't say anything, but the way his shoulders relaxed told me he understood. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how much I loved to cook, how it had always been my way of giving, of showing care, and how that love had been used against me. Every family gathering, every meal, every small gesture turned into a way for others to take without gratitude. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the same way. It was something quieter, stronger. The next morning, I woke up early and started baking. I didn't have a plan yet. I just needed to do something with my hands. The smell of warm bread filled the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't remind me of loss. It reminded me of home. George came in and watched me for a while before saying, "You know, people would pay good money for that." I laughed softly. "You think so?" "I know so. And if they don't, we'll eat it ourselves." That was how it started. A few neighbors stopped by that weekend, drawn by the smell, and I sent them home with extra rolls. The next day, one of them came back, smiling wide. "Evelyn, my husband said it's the best bread he's ever had. Can I buy a few loaves?" Her words lit something inside me. I baked more, then more after that. George helped build shelves in the dining room to hold the jars and boxes. Within weeks, people were coming by regularly. Teachers, mail carriers, even the woman who ran the small bookstore downtown. They didn't come for fancy food or perfect decor. They came because it felt like home. Every compliment, every smile, healed a small part of what Carl and Meryl had broken. I didn't tell them about it. Not yet. Meryl still sent her usual texts, pretending nothing had happened. Short messages about Carl's work, the weather, their plans. I answered politely, nothing more. Each word from her reminded me of the distance between us, the polite kind of distance that says, "I forgive you for feeling hurt," when what they really mean is, "I still don't see you." But I no longer needed her to. Weeks turned into months. The kitchen that once felt too small became alive again. The clatter of pans, the hum of the mixer, George laughing when flour covered his shirt. Every sound was a reminder that life hadn't ended in that backyard. It had only just begun again. When a friend suggested I post photos of the food online, I hesitated. "Who'd care about what some old woman bakes in her kitchen?" I said, but she did it anyway. Within days, messages poured in from people around town, asking if they could order pies or soups for the holidays. George looked at me one night, his eyes shining, and said, "Maybe it's time to give it a name." "Evelyn's table," I said quietly. It felt right. And as that name spread, so did something else. Peace. The resentment was still there. But it no longer ruled me. It was softer now, like a scar that no longer hurt to touch. Meryl's polite distance, Carl's silence, none of it mattered. I had built something of my own, with the same hands they once made me doubt. Each morning, as sunlight filled our kitchen, I'd open the windows and smell fresh bread, cinnamon, and coffee. It felt like starting over, only this time on my own terms. I still thought of my son, of course. I still loved him. But I'd finally learned that loving someone didn't mean standing still while they made you feel invisible. And maybe, someday, he'd walk through that door again. Not for food, not out of duty, but to remember what real warmth feels like. But if that day never came, I knew I'd still be fine, because I'd already found something better than forgiveness. I'd found myself again. The cafe opened on a cool Saturday morning in spring. The sign above the door read "Evelyn's Table" in simple white letters George had carved himself. The smell of fresh bread drifted out into the street, and people began to gather even before we flipped the sign to open. The first customers were neighbors, the same ones who used to wave politely but never stopped to talk. Now they came in smiling, curious, ready to try whatever was baking in the oven. I poured coffee, served slices of pie, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. Every person who sat down reminded me that kindness could find its way back when you stop chasing the wrong kind of love. By noon, the cafe was full. Laughter, the clink of cups, the hum of quiet music, it all mixed together like a melody that belonged to us. George worked beside me, his sleeves rolled up, looking 20 years younger. People complimented the food, but more than that, they talked about how it made them feel. "It tastes like home," one woman said, and that was the best compliment I could have asked for. Then, one afternoon, it happened. I was wiping down a table when I saw a familiar car park out front. It was new, shiny, and out of place in our little corner of town. The doors opened and out stepped Carl and Meryl. My breath caught for a moment. George looked up from behind the counter, his face calm, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. They walked in like customers, not family. Meryl glanced around with a polite smile, the same kind she always wore, but I noticed her eyes linger on the crowd, on the full tables, on the warmth that filled the room. Carl hesitated, his gaze moving from me to the menu board above the counter. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Hi, Carl. Welcome to Evelyn's Table." Meryl gave a little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nice. Very cozy." The word cozy came out like a placeholder for something she couldn't bring herself to say. Maybe surprise, maybe discomfort. I could feel her searching for a way to sound gracious without admitting what she saw. That the woman she once pitied had built something beautiful without her approval. They ordered coffee and a slice of pie. I served them myself. Meryl thanked me politely, then whispered to Carl, "It's charming how they kept it simple." I heard her. Every word. She hadn't changed. Still soft, still careful, still certain she was a little above the rest of us. But this time, her words didn't sting. They just floated past me like a faint breeze that couldn't reach where I stood now. Carl looked around the room, at the people greeting me by name, at George laughing with customers who used to be strangers. "You did all this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "George and I started small. The town helped us grow." He nodded slowly, eyes down. "It's really nice, Mom." It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. For a second, I almost reached out, but I stopped myself. Some moments don't need to be filled. Some truths speak best in silence. They finished their coffee and stood to leave. Meryl said, "We should come back sometime." I smiled politely, the same way she once smiled at me. "You're welcome anytime." When they walked out, I felt George's hand rest gently on my back. "You handled that well," he said. I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. I didn't need to handle it. I just needed to be here. The rest of the day passed like sunlight through clean windows, warm and clear. Customers kept coming, and the little bell above the door rang again and again. Each ring felt like proof that life could bloom again, even after you've been told you don't matter. That night, after we closed, I sat at one of the tables with a cup of tea. The cafe was quiet, the lights soft, the smell of cinnamon still in the air. George turned off the last switch and sat beside me. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, "but I don't need them to." Outside, the street was empty, except for the faint glow of our sign. I thought of all the years I'd spent waiting, for kindness, for recognition, for family that never seemed to see me. But as I looked around our little cafe, I realized something had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because they saw me, but because I finally saw myself. The resentment that once lived deep in me had lost its edge. It was still there, but quieter, like an old ache that reminds you of how far you've come. I thought of Meryl's tight smile, of Carl's unsure eyes, and instead of anger, I felt a strange kind of peace. I didn't need revenge, not anymore. The best answer to cruelty was to live without bitterness, to stand tall in your own small corner of the world and build something that mattered. As we turned off the lights and locked the door, I whispered to George, "You know, it wasn't just a cafe we built. It was a way back to ourselves." He smiled and took my hand. "That's the best kind of revenge, Evie." I looked up at the glowing sign one last time and felt something settle inside me. Not sadness, not pride, but freedom. Because I finally understood. Age is not about weakness. It's about dignity.